This is going to be pretty awesome because these three people are all deeply involved in China, the National Academy of Medicine in the United States, and the World Health Organization in deciding what's going to be done with germline genetic editing. By germline, we mean a genetic edit that's done in the early stages of an embryo, so it affects not only the person being edited, but all the reproductive genes, and therefore it goes down and is inherited, either the changes or any mutations made. The other type of editing is called somatic, where it's just done in an adult or a born human, and that only affects usually the person whom the edit is made. For ethical and moral discussions, I think it's pretty obvious why the germline question is the most difficult one. If we kind of screw it up in a human being, that's really bad for that human being, but it doesn't destroy both the planet and society. So we're going to mainly focus on germline editing. The first germline edit of a human embryo was in 2015, but they were non-viable embryos that could not be implanted and be born. After that, our panelists, you were the first on that, right? So I'll do you first. Victor Zhao, who's an old friend, is president of the National Academy of Medicine, and so they created a panel to try to figure it out. And then Duanjing Pei, is that the way to say it, sir?
Duanjing Pei.
Duanjing Pei is from Guangzhou, and he's on the Guangzhou Academy of Medicine, but is also involved with the Chinese Academy of Medicine and how to handle germline editing in the future. And all of us know Peggy Hamburg, the FDA commissioner for the Obama administration, old friend of the Aspen Institute, old friend of ours. And fortunately for us, she's been tasked to be the co-chair, I think, of the World Health Organization that's supposed to try to develop policies of whether or not countries can do this. So let me start immediately with you, Duanjing Pei, because you, as well as Victor, were at this amazing meeting in last November in Hong Kong when one of your fellow countrymen, J.K. Hay, Dr. Hay, announced, I assume to your surprise, but you can tell us, that he had edited human embryos and that twins had been given birth with edited germline edits. Tell me about being in Hong Kong, hearing about that, and as a Chinese official, what was your reaction? Pride or horror?
Thank you, Walter, for having us here. So Victor initially invited me to be part of the international summit back in 2015. And so that was all of the report. They were CRISPR injected into a triplet embryo with a non-viable embryo, Walter just said. And then I think very courageously, I think Victor and also the National Academy of Sciences, also the Chinese Academy of Sciences organized this summit and try to sort of organize and then set the path forward how this particular technology should be deployed.
You're talking, though, not after Dr. Hay's announcement, but the 2015.
Yeah, so that's sort of background. I need to give you that background. But in China, as you know, there's a law prohibiting, or a regulation prohibiting any modification of the embryo or gametes. And if you do, that's against very severe punishment. So back in 2015, everybody asking me, would this ever happen in China? My answer is absolutely no. There will be no way this will be happening in China because a very clear law prohibiting this happening. Because all the IVF clinics are licensed by the government. They're all operated by university, credible hospitals. And if you ever do anything illegal like that, and they will revoke your license, they will most likely put you in jail, right? So that was my answer to the panelists back in 2015. So obviously, when this come, I thought this is unreal. So that was my first reaction.
So you were in Shanghai, you were in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Dr. Hay makes an announcement, you're there, and you're horrified.
Yeah.
And
it's even to this day, I would say, why would somebody do something like that against a very clear stipulation?
So you said you would be arrested if you did it. Was he arrested? Is he under arrest now?
I think he is under investigation. In Chinese terms, I think there are certain restrictions on his, because they have to investigate that by law. So they have to answer why he did this. So the certain.
Is he under house arrest?
I don't know, but.
Victor?
I was going to describe what happened. We invited Dr. He not because we knew that he was doing this, but because he's done some nice work on primates. And the night before.
But that's questionable, though.
Yeah, well, the night, but not about.
But
human
then
anyway.
let me just clarify. So this is very unusual because when we invite people to come to our meeting, typically based on their scientific publication. A scientific publication will be a set of results gone through peer review, ethical review, well done, and then that's some sort of everything. We accept it, and then we invite people to come. And I think he just called somebody, and then I had this, and the committee debated whether to have him speak or not to speak, actually.
But nothing to do with what he announced. So the day before the meeting, there was a public announcement that he did it.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine how we all scrambled and decided whether he should be on the program or not. And 4 of us met with him at dinner to go over his data. He was willing to share the data and looked reasonably credible.
This is in the hotel in Hong Kong
exactly.
with Robin Lovell Badge, right?
Exactly. Right.
And I think Jennifer Doudna had flown over because
Yes.
she had heard of
Yes,
this news.
exactly. So then he said he checked out the hotel to say, there's a lot of threat, that he got threats through email, etc., and that he just simply went into silence. The second day of meeting, he showed up, and so he presented his data. You remember this. There were about 250 press there, and the press is about to storm the stage. We have to control this, and importantly, we live streamed it. There were 1.8 million viewers. It's a big issue. So I think what really came out is his rationalization of doing this in a non-life-threatening disease, arguing that, in fact, he's following some of the guidance from various reports.
Okay, let me real quickly put you on the spot on that because it gets to the guidance that you were trying to give. For those who don't know, Dr. He tried to do it with a gene that would allow a receptor not to be as susceptible to HIV
right.
infection. Leave aside the complexities of whether that would work. That was his rationale. After 2015, when it was decided, hey, we have to go slow on this, and y'all were on the panel, you put a whole lot of recommendations out there. There were a whole lot of tests, but you didn't say, let's have a moratorium. And so this guy ran through it. Did you make a mistake in not calling for a moratorium?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's important to understand that what was said was it really shouldn't be done now because we're not ready. So if you want to find what a moratorium means, but we did say you need to meet all these conditions and you have to have a compelling medical reason. You could argue whether HIV, which is treatable, is a compelling medical reason. So I think that our report in 2017 was still correct, but maybe travel a little bit at a high level. The principles, which was left for interpretation. And now I think what we need to do is to make sure that we get this
Now,
right.
Peggy, I promise I'm going to get to you. We have one more
okay.
question, which is, even if you had made it really strict, and you said we have to have a moratorium, you didn't have all these treatable diseases, do you think Dr. He would have just gone ahead and done it anyway?
Probably.
There was a law against it in
because,
China.
right.
No. It's actually the Chinese law is very clear.
Yeah.
So I used to give the analogy, say, there's a law clearly say you shouldn't kill anybody, right? Yeah. And you see so many murders around anyway.
Right.
So that's sort of the analogy I gave. There's always somebody, but in the case of IVFs, they're all very clearly regulated. So I don't think he did it in a real licensed IVF clinic.
Let me get to Peggy. I'm
So
sorry
that's
that
quite all right.
we geeked out on the Hong Kong announcement. But so now you're in charge, or at least co-chair in charge, of the world trying to figure this out. The World
That wasn't
Health
quite our mandate.
Tell us what your mandate is.
Well, we were asked by the Director General of the World Health Organization in response to these events and the recognition that there was this incredibly important technology that was evolving that had huge positive implications for treating, curing, preventing disease, but also could be misapplied in serious ways, including, as you noted in your introduction, changing the germline and heritable conditions in permanent ways into the future. So he put together a group that's very diverse in terms of background, so scientists as well as regulatory experts, legal experts, and ethicists from all around the world to help WHO think about how can we create a framework for global governance and oversight of this sort of set of technologies, because CRISPR-Cas9, which we're talking about here, isn't the only way of doing gene editing. It is sort of the most recent, and it will continue to evolve, probably with greater specificity and capability. And we need to be able to think about it not just in the more advanced scientifically countries like the US and Europe and China, but in terms of what it means for countries all around the world. So the task to us was really to think about, first, what kinds of research and development in this area is relevant that WHO needs to be thinking about. What kinds of standards and practices for responsible stewardship of biological science should we be drawing on in this instance? And then what are the attributes of effective governance frameworks, and how can the different elements be applied at an institutional level, an individual practice level, and then at a national and regional and global level, recognizing that there is no one answer to how we provide oversight of this kind of a technology.
And do you think different countries will do it differently, just like different countries have different feelings about genetically modified
Absolutely,
organisms?
and different countries have different regulatory standards. I think how countries approach the oversight of this kind of science and the regulatory context in which it occurs reflects a lot the history of the country, the social values of the country, and also the scientific capabilities of the country. But every country, every person on the earth has a stake in what happens in this realm of science. So I think WHO has a sense of real responsibility about playing a role, not in isolation, but working with the broader scientific community.
Give me an example of the type of specificity that you hope to come out with to recommend to countries, such as you should be able to do germline editing for a clear genetic disease, but not for boom.
Well, I would be getting way out in front of our committee and our work if I did that. But what I would say is that we feel that it is very, very important that our work be done recognizing, number one, that there is going to be, dare I say, a Chinese menu of options, that we will not, say this is the absolute framework and normative standards that we recommend.
Do you have any sanctions you could use on a country that says, to heck with it, we are just going to allow this willy-nilly and have a great tourist industry of people who want to enhance their kids?
I think one of the great questions is exactly that. And it is very hard in many realms of science to absolutely enforce the practice and standards. But there are different overlays of normative standards, the culture of science, the expectations of funders of science, the expectations of publishers of science, that all help how scientists are trained, how science is communicated in research conferences and within institutions. All of those things have to align to help support the best, most responsible science.
I know, Victor, you want to get in, but but Peggy I made her go last, so I have one more quick thing for you, which is, when you try to, because you've been in many administrations, when you try to do that with nuclear weapons, you could have a START treaty and INF treaties and non-proliferation, and you pretty much can assure that people aren't going to just make atom bombs and surprise you, although it's happened in Pakistan and other places. Is this technology something that's even controllable?
Well, this isn't, first of all, unique in the life sciences in terms of complex science that can be used to do enormous good, but can also be misused and abused. And those of us that have spent part of our careers working on biological terrorism and biological weapons understand that very well.
Do you know where most of the funding in the United States now comes for CRISPR-Cas9?
I don't.
DARPA, the
DARPA.
Defense Department,
Well,
using
that doesn't
it both to
completely
weaponize
surprise
it
me.
and defend against weapons.
Yeah, but so I think that we have to recognize that this is not like nuclear weapons where you can have guns and guards and padlocks to have a security regimen. This really involves the scientific community stepping up to the plate and taking responsibility, as well as a set of governmental standards and enforcement mechanisms. And it's, I think, one of the great challenges of our time.
Victor.
Well, first I was going to ask Peggy, which Chinese restaurant do you go to? I don't know of a menu that's got column A and column B anymore. We're
She
both
lives
from
in
China,
Washington,
so.
which is a food desert.
Right.
But no, I think the issue is getting to basics. So earlier we chatted that when this area all started, the well-meaning scientific community and medical community says, how can we self-regulate, right? We know that in 1974 was a famous Silmar conference that says, recombinant DNA, how do we regulate? And that, of course, allowed us to move forward with all the great advances with a good governance structure. So this is how we got involved, and we're back involved again because we put out this 2017 report. And I think that Peggy's got a big job ahead of her because trying to get all the countries to agree. But our intention is to go back to the basics and ask about the scientific basis, the medical basis, the medical ethics, the regulatory environment framework, and specific conditions. And how do you know when it's ready and it's safe?
Yeah, and to make it clear, what you're talking about is that you and Dr. Pei are on a separate group. That's the National Academy of Medicine in the United States, the one in Britain, the one in China. You all are involved in your own separate task force to figure out genetic editing, should we do it? And you're more digging down into the science of it. But
Absolutely.
let me ask...
But can I say something?
Yes,
we have 27 academies
Right.
and organizations signed up, so there'll be one report. It's an international commission that
Correct.
National Academy is moving forward.
But why
So you
will
won't
there
have a
not
bit-
be, why, I was up in Quebec, I told you all this right before, for the CRISPR conference last week. And from Jennifer Doudna, who helped to co-invent CRISPR-Cas9, to Feng Zhang, who helped co-invent the ways to put it in human cells, they all criticize you all by saying the WHO is off doing its own thing on policy, and all the national academies of medicine are doing something totally different. They should merge efforts, because the last time around we got 2 or 3 different reports, and so nobody knew what to do. Why don't you all merge right here, right now, and make it the Aspen Consensus?
We both work in the same place. But
Yeah.
I will put it this way. This time there'll be one report from the scientific medical community. That's important. There were several, to be sure. And then we are coordinated with WHO. If you listen to the mandate, she's got a lot of work to do to how they get the countries involved. So I think our report can be quite foundational to their deliberation because it's a big job.
And that's the point, is that, there is no one group of a dozen people, 24 people that can sit in a room and decide for all the world what needs to be done. This needs to be looked at in a multifaceted way, and there are different parts of the puzzle that need to be put together into a coherent whole. They're digging much more deeply into the science than we are. We're thinking about it in the context of a need to provide some normative guidance and oversight recommendations for countries that look very, very different
That's it.
and have different requirements. So we're working closely with them. We're going to build on what they do. We are timing actually our work so that we will finish after they do so that we can be fully informed. We need what they're doing to inform what we're doing. But if we tried to have one committee that took on all the aspects of this complicated task, we would just be so bogged down we'd make no progress whatsoever. So it's going to be iterative. What the work
Yeah.
we do is going to have to be further developed.
Let me get Dr. Pei in then, because I want to know what China is doing on its own.
So, so just back to the 2017 report I was involved in. I think that's a very important document, the consensus report. It laid out, I think, 7 principles and 10 different guidelines on how this should be proceed. So when the Hong Kong announcement came out, I bought, I think, 100 copies with me. So they said, is this legal? Not legal? I said, don't ask me, read this report. And we hand out those reports. I think it's well received in Hong Kong. I bought 100 copies.
You translate the Chinese.
So now I have translated that document into Chinese and just been published by the Chinese Science Report, Chinese Science Press with permission from the National Academy of Sciences. So the dissemination of this knowledge is critical. I think despite the criticism you heard from Quebec, but the one strong positive message is you have one single document. It pretty much has everything you need to set up a policy.
Let's move on to the policy, because we've talked what the ethics should be. Do you, Dr. Pei, believe that germline editing of a human genome should be done for, let's start with, trying to fix, assuming it's practical, simple single edit maladies like Huntington's, sickle cell, Tay-Sachs?
So I maybe, my personal view wouldn't count too much, but in one of our conferences, I can tell you, just like a conference like this in China organized, I asked the people, if there's such this one, would you sort of allow this to happen? And the consensus is actually pretty positive. They say, if this is such a great technology, it can benefit our human health, although without knowing too much how much would that be, and actually the response is probably about 60 or 70%. Mm-hmm. But that's said, but then still that's just a sort of like you raise your hand, that's very, that can shift anywhere, right? Yeah. But that's just an initial reaction. But I don't know what they would say after they read the report.
But I'm more interested in what you would say, because you're one of the world's experts. So I would say, I think in the future, maybe 100 years from now, we understood, and everybody agree in this room, this is a technology we should deploy with caution, and it may happen. 100 years from now.
Oh my.
Why not?
Victor?
I think.
I think we need. Sorry, Victor. Just ever since that report came out, I think it has been very positively received in China, and then I think every graduate student now is reading that, because this is sort of a prototypic, ethical, advanced technology, how that impact us.
But let me make clear, we all understand what you meant by 100 years. It'll be far, far sooner we'll be able to do things like single gene mutations, such as Huntington's, Tay-Sachs, sickle cell, right? In your mind.
So in my mind, so I give you one reference point. So gene therapy, the idea of gene therapy has been around for how many years? And as far as I know, only recently, FDA gave the okay or green light for gene therapy to deploy it. So that, I think, with CRISPR, maybe next generation of CRISPR, I think it may take a little longer than we think.
But if you were in charge in China, or at least in Guangzhou, would you allow CRISPR-Cas9 editing of Huntington's and Tay-Sachs and others as soon as it was effective?
Well, so as a scientist, yes, I would very much like this to be sort of go to the clinic as soon as we can. But then in China, we have a very strict regulation how this can be done. Without changing that law, I don't think any credible institution would be able to put their resources into that practice.
Well, I'm a physician, and when you see the sufferings of people with lethal genetic diseases, very moving. I think that science needs to be put into the right way to enable cures and saving lives. So my feeling is there's nothing intrinsically wrong about technology, it's how we use it. So I would hope that this will see the light of day soon. As soon as
meaning 5 to 10 years.
Well, I think this is what we need. Okay, we need to know how safe it is. And you do a single twins and you have no idea what the long-term effect is, right? We need to be able to say, is it ethically supported by the society? But I think importantly, as I said earlier, if you imagine that you have a new cell therapy or drug, FDA usually, regulatory agencies will say, I know it's safe in long term because you got to do these things first. Toxicology, animal study. None of this exists at this point. I think once we get that to that stage and we're convinced it's safe and useful, absolutely, I'd like to see it happen.
Okay, and let's try to keep this on the ethical issues as opposed to the regulatory and practical things, because we know it takes 5, 10, 50, you know better than anybody. Yeah. But I just want to press you. You have absolutely no hesitation that you could use it to fix diseases, and you should.
I mean, I think the science has to evolve still. We are not at the point where I think any of us would think it would be responsible to move.
Right, no, we understand that, but at a certain point
so I
it will
think
be.
we need to continue to advance the science and advance the science in the context of a clear understanding of how do you ask and answer the questions of safety, efficacy, clinical utility, and the appropriate regulatory oversight and societal context for its implementation and use.
Well, let's
so we're not there
focus
yet.
not on the safety and efficacy, because that will come as it comes. But would you feel personally that we should edit the germline of human genomes to fix diseases once the efficacy and safety is decided?
I think that if we can treat and cure devastating diseases in a way that is safe and effective and is appropriately regulated, then we should. But we're not there yet, and we don't know what the future is going to look like. But I think we have a responsibility to really deepen our understanding of what the science is, what the opportunities are, and how we can responsibly steward that scientific advance forward, and ultimately what it will take to implement it.
But Victor, let us assume, as I said, that the efficacy, safety, regulatory issues aside, morally,
My own opinion?
your own opinion.
I think for lethal genetic diseases that you can fix and you can't do it any other way, yeah, I'd like to see that happen.
Would you do it for other, how far would you push it? Would you do it for somebody being born as dwarfism or deafness?
Yeah. So let me finish my point
Sure.
about diseases first. So you mentioned sickle cell.
Correct.
There's another way to cure sickle cell. You can do bone marrow transplant and gene edit the stem cells, right? Now there are ways to do inducible pluripotent stem cells. So all that, you don't have to go into the embryo.
Right.
So once you get into the embryo, you're going to change the genetic makeup forever. That's the important ethical issue.
So you would draw a line that if there's any other possible way of doing it, including bone marrow transplants and pre-implantation of embryos, you would not allow gene editing if there's any other possible way to do it?
I would say at this point, yes. But I would argue at some point in the future, this technique is to be so effective and safe that we should think about really treating for generations.
And yes, Dr.
That was the principle laid out in the consensus study. So it had to be absolutely no alternative. Therefore, this may be permitted with broader societal consent. That was a very accurate statement we made in that consensus report. So I was talking to many of our leading Chinese colleagues back home. They say, you're crazy. We never should edit our genome. That's actually a very prevailing thought too. Those are the well-learned, respected scientists. They actually very, very negative.
Why?
It's just that this is something we shouldn't really touch.
Okay. Is there
That's
something
one actually
really
very-
huge moral that Dr. Pei has put his finger on, that we shouldn't play God?
Oh, absolutely. I think we, again, as a physician, we're trying to save lives, not to play God. So you kind of led us into this whole issue of enhancement, right? And then would you add it to make your children brighter with high IQ, with greater? I think right now the prevailing feeling is no, we can't do that. Aside from the fact that we don't really know the science behind it, because the genes
Yeah, but let's
involved-
leave aside the science, yeah.
I think that it's very clear from our report, and almost
But
everyone just
Walter,
said that
science
should
is
be done.
an integral part of that because the genome has been evolved for so many years to be as perfect as it is. I mean, artificial tampering with it, there are many, many consequences we don't even aware of.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
we only sequenced the genome how many years ago? And we're still studying the genome the way it surprises us every day. So if you think you can, do this, something magical to happen, as a biologist, I think I'm not that confident at this point.
I think that there's also another really important ethical question here, which is part of what the WHO committee really wants to take on, which is that there will be, you touched on it, a huge attraction in certain countries and by certain people to exploit this evolving technology and what people believe about it, whether it's even true, and medical tourism, and a new term I learned recently, ethical dumping, which means that in countries that have less stringent legal regulatory frameworks, that clinics will start to emerge where people are offering
Blue eyes.
interventions that they actually can't deliver on, but they'll be happy to collect money for it. Maybe they actually will start to do some of this. The technology, I think one of the challenges is it's increasingly accessible. It doesn't require, really advanced training to be able to do it. The materials you can get, over the internet or in, standard
Dr. Hay ordered
biology
them online.
labs, right? I think that one of the things that the WHO committee is going to try to look at, not, answering the question of how much will we play God, but how can we reduce potential harm? How can we try to create enough transparency, understanding, and systems so that we can at least reduce the exploitation and the inappropriate, irresponsible science that can and likely will occur.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's already happened because many of you may know about mitochondrial disease. Mm-hmm. And so that mitochondrial replacement therapy is what they call the three-parent approach. So the mother carries the mutation in the mitochondria. There's some DNA in there. Mm-hmm. And so that's passed from generations onwards. And now, of course, it's possible to take the nucleus of the mother and then implant it into an egg of, a donor, and then have the father fertilize the egg, and therefore through IVF. Mm-hmm. And so we actually did a study on this to say we're not ready.
I was FDA commissioner and asked you to
That's
do
right,
that.
thank you.
Yeah.
And we say we're not ready. Guess what? One of the famous person in vitro fertilization in this country went to Mexico and performed it.
Sure.
But to show how countries are
That's
different.
what medical tourism
Yeah,
you meant by
exactly.
that.
But to show how countries are different, the UK went through a responsible process and
And they
decided
said
that
it's okay.
the science was safe, and it is legal in the UK to.
That's
to
why
do
I think
that
you got
work.
such a tough job trying to create a global governance.
All right.
Each country is so different.
Before I open it up, I want to ask the very high-level question, which has nothing to do with is there other ways to do it, or is it possible that easy? But I'm going to ask the question of, if it could be done, what is wrong with enhancement? In other words, not just fixing a disease, but having a clinic to say, you want your kids to have blue eyes, boom, they'll have blue eyes. You want them to have higher muscle mass, boom, it'll happen. Why is that morally offensive? Dr. Pei. Those of us who hire SAT tutors for our kids have to work.
Well, if, this is very personal, right? I mean, every one of you can ask yourself, would you want to do that?
Okay, let's do it. Who, if you knew that your children or grandchildren could be edited to have certain personal enhancing traits safely, be taller, blue-eyed, whatever, who would do it in this room?
Surprising.
Okay, that's about the same. I told you about the Pew.
Pew report, yeah.
The Pew's Research Center did a big survey, American survey, 2018, and that's about it. 16%, somewhere around there, says yes. About 70-some% says disease, cure disease.
Yeah, and about 40% of them are lying.
Can I wish to rephrase the question Walter just asked. I think part of having offspring is to carry our genes to the next generation. If you would alter that gene, you're not passing on your own genes down the line. Would you still want to do that?
Interesting. Peggy, do you have an answer there?
All I can say is that when I first heard the idea about SAT tutors, I thought, this is insane. Why would people do that? And then I realized that everybody else was doing it. And so, yeah.
But that's different, though.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, no.
That's very
of
different.
course. I mean, I just think that these are questions that us three are not particularly equipped to provide, the most relevant insights. I think these are questions that as individuals and as a society, we are going to have to grapple with. There's no doubt about it. But it's hard to be glib about these.
I think you need a bunch of ethicists up here. But I would answer this way. When people ask for moratorium, and I've talked to Eric Lander, others quite a bit on this, and they write, in the sense that at this point of time, many genes are pleiotropic. That is, they perform many different functions. You change one, you don't know what the consequence of the others. So that's true, right?
Yeah, but that's true.
Yeah. Secondly is that, we are, through generations, millions of years, we've evolved naturally. It's a genetic pool that we have maintained.
Yeah.
And when we start manipulating this and forever change it because it will be passed on to generations, we are really upsetting an evolutionary system. Is it good or bad? Well, you can decide for yourself.
And that's what Dr. Pei said, too, which is really, I think Dr. Francis Collins and Eric have both said it, is that evolution has been doing this for 3.2 billion years. Why do we think 5 years after we've gotten a good gene sequence, we should change it?
And you don't know the consequences of doing it.
And I'll give a quick answer of my own, even though I'm not a panelist, and then open it up, which is the other problem I have, both with SAT tutors, but writ 1,000-fold with genetic engineering, is that it probably is almost impossible to have it be totally equitable, where a family in a village in India and a family in Uzbekistan and somebody from Scarsdale will all have the equal ability to enhance the genes of their children. And the Brave New World problem, everybody should go back and read Huxley's book, is about creating a two-tiered society of the genetically enhanced, the top 1 to 5 to 10%, that could have taller children with more muscle mass. When I say taller and more muscle mass, that's not too far down the road because we do that in animals now. We're able to increase them with a genetic. Likewise, blue eyes is not the hardest thing, and IQ is much, much harder, but you can imagine that we would create a society where all the advantages that the privileged now have, which I call the SAT tutor advantages, would be not only multiplied by 1,000, but literally encoded into our DNA. And so to me, that's the big ethical problem
Well said.
that we can't do. Let me open it up. Yes, sir.
Walter, could you
Hey, how are you? Sorry, I didn't recognize you with the light right behind me.
Could you expand a little bit on what you think?
I'll repeat it. Expand a little bit on what you think.
The implications of DARPA funding all this CRISPR-Cas9 research is?
Oh, yeah.
I defer to the experts, but I do know a lot about what DARPA is doing.
Please.
Well, I'll start. DARPA, number one, is very interested in cutting-edge technologies and has supported a lot of work in a range of areas. But there also is a clear implication for enhancing the capabilities and safety of warfighters. Whether it's making them stronger and tougher, making them resistant to certain infectious problems or other toxic exposures, making them able to be alert longer. There are a lot of ideas about how you could use these technologies to actually strengthen military capacity.
And you don't have to do an embryo. Walter talked about somatic. So you can actually put in your muscle. And right now, for example, in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, people are able to do gene editing in the muscles and now moving to human therapy. All you need is about 15-20% of those cells have been edited. You see significant improvement in function.
And what Victor just said is actually important, because I've stressed during this panel germline editing, which everybody keeps pushing back and saying it's 5, 10, 50, 100 years down the road.
Yeah.
But we already have genetic editing that's actually being done today pretty effectively on Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Right. Who was from Columbus, Ohio at the Children's Hospital? I saw earlier a great guy there who has just done it, and I met the child that he saved. But oh yeah, there you are. The other thing on DARPA real quickly is you could create genetically modified mosquitoes with a gene drive that would take the entire mosquito population. And you could wipe out whatever you wanted to in a village in North Korea if you decided to do it with mosquitoes rather than with a missile. Now, to defend DARPA...
You could also wipe out malaria, but...
Right, and you could wipe out malaria if you wanted. And that is what the gene drive they're doing from the Broad Institute is trying to gene drive mosquitoes to knock out malaria and to knock out
dengue
Zika,
and Zika.
The Zika virus, all of which sounds good to me. But I remember reading Rachel Carson's Silent Spring when they were knocking out problems like mosquito issues with DDT, and all of a sudden the pelicans in my home state disappeared. So I think if you release genetically modified mosquitoes, either to knock out Zika or to attack somebody, that's almost as frightening to me as enhancing the muscle mass of a human.
Hi. So you posed the question a lot of, would you do it on these single gene horrific diseases? But it wasn't clear to me at all as to when you would do that rather than just select the embryo that doesn't have the single gene mutation. It didn't come across clearly as to why you do that. Yeah. Secondly, how much how verified is it that the gene edited twins really exist? How far has that gone?
Okay.
And
I will give Dr. Pei
what's happening to them at the moment?
And real quickly, you're explaining what is sometimes called pre-implantation genetic counseling and other things, where you have a whole lot of embryos and you pick the one that doesn't have sickle cell or Huntington's. A couple of answers to that. One is, in very few cases, and that probably shouldn't drive us, that can't be, like with Huntington's, if both parents have, et cetera. The other question is, what if it just becomes easier to do it through genetic editing than to have people produce a whole lot of embryos, and which is ickier? Which is playing God worse? I don't know. Do you have a...
No, I think this is exactly why the committee is being formed to debate those issues. So I want to give you my own personal opinion. I think that's what the commission is supposed to do.
No, come on. Give an opinion.
No, but I think people have argued that, you can use PGD, do in vitro fertilization, pick the embryo that doesn't carry the gene and do it. That could be one of the conditions for gene editing, right? That you fail the whole process.
Yeah, no alternative.
No alternatives. I don't know what that's going to be recommendations.
Dr. Pei, do the twins exist?
So they were even doing the summit, enough doubts whether that really happened. I think we even put in a statement that need to be independently verified. I think the information is not there yet. I think once the investigation by the authority, I think they're going to release that. It's a duty for us to know.
Stefan?
We have to know.
I feel like the good old days when I first came to Aspen. Stefan's hand was always the first one up.
By the way, Dr. Pei at that, Dr. Herr at that meeting also said there's a second pregnancy that's ongoing.
And by the way, whether or not they exist, which I think it's probably likely they do. I mean, it's a little hard to fake this whole thing. The Russian doctor now says he's going to do it. So I think we have to face the issues, even if, yeah. I mean, it's starting to happen one way or the other.
I have a very simple question. Everybody seems to know how to do it. I don't know. What are the mechanics of identifying a gene? Is it a little object? Does it have sand on it? This gene is blue-eyed. And what does this gene is for blackheads? How do you actually identify?
All right, which of you is best at that?
Victor.
Victor was on the Human Genome Project earlier
I
on,
would
probably.
say it goes something like this. We now know enough of the sequences on the genome and the disease genes. This technique that Doudna and others developed used what they call a guide RNA, just a piece of RNA that is fitting to that piece of the genetic disease that you have, the mutations. Once you get the guide RNA to work and find the sequence, it's like a missile finding its place, there's a set of enzymes called endonuclease that will cut off precisely that sequence. And that's how you do it.
And the gene is just...
Is a physical membrane? Physical.
Well, it goes into the nucleus, and it will physically bind the DNA, that particular sequence it's guided towards, and then with that, you use an endonuclease to cut it, an enzyme. It's quite amazing.
Vinod, who is doing delivery mechanisms in his own company, so...
So my question relates to the two babies, Lulu and Nana, I believe are the
Yeah.
names. There was some question about whether they exist. I mean, I think if we assume they exist, what is going to happen to them?
What is going to happen to Lulu and Nana if they exist?
Oh, so I think the proper authority has to decide, how to deal with them, and I think the summit committee made some recommendations already.
Yeah.
In terms of identity and how should they be identified, should not they not be identified.
I think part of a condition of going forward, which is to be considered our commission, is to say you have to know what happens to long-term follow-up of all these babies, right? Because when they grow up 50 years later, are there any surprise or whatever? That has to be part of a condition to move forward.
But what about the privacy of that individual who might say, I don't want my name out there?
Well,
So
then
that
maybe
hasn't
you
been
don't do it,
decided yet.
right?
Okay.
But that raises an interesting question, because the privacy of the individual doesn't exist. It's the parents who's going to say yes.
Walter, I'm just curious about why you picked this topic for your next book, and
Well, after this panel, can't you see?
and when is the book going to be released?
I don't know. It'll be a couple of years from now. I'm in no rush. But I picked it because I believe that the first half of the 20th century was totally defined, perhaps in 1905, you could say, with Einstein's 3 great papers in a century of physics that brought us everything from the atom bomb to space travel to GPS to microchips to quantum theory. Second half of the 20th century, with the invention of the computer, the microchip, and the network, was an information technology century. What we will grapple with for the first half of the 20th century is the life sciences technology. Many people, not people in this room, but many people out there just have no clue as to what it's all about. And so I'm doing a book because, A, I want to have a clue of what it's about, but also perhaps allow other people to understand the issues we're discussing here. Yes, sir.
There's one area that you haven't touched at all, and I'm glad you haven't, because it's even more complicated than what you all have been talking about. That's the morality. Wait, look, part of this country, especially those people who are still in the Trump, the morality becomes the most important thing they talk about. Conquer our head. How do we deal with that issue, or maybe it's not an issue?
The morals of editing a gene. Well, I think we tried to deal with it.
I mean, if you want to, we don't want to go into politics, I know, but the whole issue of how do you achieve the right balance between what is the responsible stewardship of science based on the scientific community and the public and politicians all trying to align. And I think we unfortunately have seen how sometimes politics and purely legislative approaches can lead to actually a chilling of the environment for science, a limiting of opportunity for important science to go forward. And I think that's something I'm very worried about at the present time. This, I think, is an issue that is especially complicated because it's actually dealing with the very meaning of what it is to be human in many ways. And so I think this is one, and I applaud you for wanting to take it on, because this is one where the public really needs to be educated, and we need to be able to have, thoughtful, in-depth conversations in communities and as a nation and around the world.
It's only the beginning, right?
Yeah.
And you know that, as you said, the decade or century of life sciences, all the things that we can do. So it's really important that we actually stay ahead and start thinking about the issues of ethics, governance, equity that you emphasize. I think this is a very big issue for our society.
Dr. Pei,
It's
final words.
It's a unique opportunity for all of us to work together because we all share one single genome. They're all in all of us. I think this is a unified, maybe can unite us somehow, some way.
And as we talk about the ethics of doing this, it's easy to talk about the ethics of why you would stop something, but we also have to keep in mind, as Peggy reminded us, that it may be unethical for us not to try to pursue this science if it makes us all healthier and better in the long run. I really want to thank you all. This was really interesting.
Thank you.